No announcement. No ceremonial statement. Just a closed door, a delayed schedule, and whispers moving faster than official briefings. Inside the palace, reports began circulating that King Charles had quietly taken a step. No modern monarch was expected to make limiting Queen Camilla's authority over a royal trust. After questions emerged about financial irregularities, no one wanted discussed. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, almost nobody noticed. Royal schedules shift all the time. Appearances are postponed. Meetings disappear from public calendars. Statements arrive late. But those who watch the monarchy closely, those who track patterns rather than headlines, began pointing to something unusual. Several engagements quietly adjusted. Internal meetings reportedly expanded. Administrative staff who normally moved freely through familiar routines were suddenly operating behind an unusual level of discretion. Officially, nothing had changed. Unofficially, reports suggest everything had. According to various interpretations circulating among royal observers and insiders, concern began building around the administration of a royal trust connected to long-term stewardship rather than personal wealth. That distinction mattered. Within royal circles, trusts are rarely framed as simple financial vehicles. They represent continuity, obligation, legacy carried across generations, which is why even the suggestion of intervention immediately elevated the situation beyond ordinary palace administration. The whispers intensified when reports emerged that King Charles, already managing a reduced public schedule while continuing treatment and balancing constitutional responsibilities, had begun receiving unusually frequent private briefings. Different accounts describe documents arriving in restricted batches. Meetings extended beyond expected times. Senior aides reportedly moved in and out through channels usually reserved for sensitive institutional matters. None of this proved anything. But within royal ecosystems, silence itself becomes a language. Courtiers, according to Palace Watch reporting and long-standing patterns of royal administration, allegedly noticed changes that felt impossible to ignore. Access became narrower. Conversations became shorter. Requests that once moved through familiar pathways were suddenly redirected. Some described unusual movement of files and authorizations. Others insisted it was simply standard modernization and nothing more. Yet that explanation never fully settled the speculation. Because if this had been routine, why the secrecy? Why the silence? And why did conversations begin shifting from finances to something far more serious: stewardship? That word appeared repeatedly in palace-adjacent commentary. Not missing assets, not losses. Stewardship, responsibility, preservation. Observers began suggesting the concern, if one existed at all, may not have been about numbers on a ledger, but about who ultimately controlled decisions tied to institutional legacy. That distinction changed everything. Because questions about money create headlines, questions about stewardship create power struggles. Reports suggest some within palace circles began quietly interpreting the alleged intervention not as punishment, but as containment, a temporary restructuring, designed to reassure institutional guardians that oversight remained intact. Others rejected the entire narrative as exaggerated speculation built from coincidence and timing. But even among competing explanations, one rumor refused to disappear. That authority itself, not ownership, not status, not title, but authority, may have been quietly adjusted. No announcement followed. No denial arrived. And with every passing day, the absence of clarity became louder than any statement could have been. Because if authority had truly been removed, the real question wasn't what disappeared, it was who discovered it first. Royal estates are never described as possessions. They are presented as obligations held temporarily, protected carefully, passed forward quietly, which is why any suggestion of confusion surrounding one of those institutions instantly becomes explosive. That was the detail that transformed quiet speculation into something far more difficult to contain. Because inside the language of monarchy, Ownership has always been differently from stewardship. The public often imagines royal structures as enormous collections of property, influence, and inherited privilege. But within institutional tradition, the official narrative has always been something else entirely. These assets are not meant to belong to individuals, they are meant to survive them. And according to the interpretations now circulating through palace commentary and royal analysis, that distinction may explain why recent reports created such unusual concern. The trust at the center of the discussion, never fully defined in public conversation, and interpreted differently depending on the source, was increasingly being described not as a reserve of private wealth, but as a mechanism of continuity. A structure designed to preserve obligations across generations. Something meant to outlast personalities, relationships, and even reigns. Which meant that if questions were truly being raised internally, the implications immediately became larger than numbers. Reports suggest administrative attention began focusing less on loss and more on process. That difference mattered, because financial discrepancies can mean many things: timing, classification, delayed approvals, miscommunication, competing accounting frameworks. Yet in royal institutions, even small inconsistencies become amplified not necessarily because of what they are, but because of what they symbolize. And suddenly, interpretations multiplied. One version claimed ordinary internal review had been misunderstood and turned into palace gossip. Another suggested that long-standing structures were being reorganized due to changes in royal operations and Charles's reduced schedule. Others whispered something more dramatic, that concerns had emerged over how decisions were being made, who had access, and whether established boundaries had quietly shifted over time. No version arrived with confirmation, but none fully disappeared either. Observers close to royal reporting traditions began pointing toward signs of heightened administrative sensitivity. Internal reviews, increased consultation, additional oversight. Language that sounded procedural on the surface but unusually serious underneath. Not accusations, not investigations, reviews. That word appeared repeatedly, because institutions rarely move dramatically at first. They move carefully, quietly, through committees, memoranda, restricted circulation, and conversations that never appear in public schedules. And increasingly, reports suggested concern was centering on perception, not criminal wrongdoing. Optics. How would it look if questions emerged and nothing had been examined? How would it look if stewardship appeared personal rather than institutional? How would it look if authority became associated with access instead of responsibility? Those questions created pressure of their own. Because monarchies survive through confidence as much as structure, public trust becomes part of the architecture itself. And once narratives begin forming around stewardship, even speculative ones, they become difficult to separate from broader concerns about continuity. That was the fear now being whispered. Not collapse, not scandal, but erosion. The possibility that uncertainty itself could become the story. And as discussions shifted further away from accounting and closer toward governance, a more uncomfortable realization quietly began taking shape. What began as accounting questions soon evolved into something much more dangerous: questions of influence. Power inside palaces rarely arrives through titles alone. It arrives through schedules, advisors, signatures, and who gets invited into the room. That realization changed the tone of the conversation almost overnight. Because once questions moved beyond accounting and entered the territory of influence, the discussion stopped being about administration and started becoming something far more sensitive. Royal institutions are built on hierarchy in public, but in practice, influence often operates quietly. Access becomes currency, timing becomes leverage, presence becomes authority long before authority is formally acknowledged. And according to the interpretations now spreading through palace commentary, that may have been exactly where concern began to gather. Reports suggest that beneath the visible structure of the monarchy exists a far more layered system of advisory networks, private consultations, institutional guardians, long-serving staff, constitutional specialists, and trusted circles that shape decisions long before they ever appear publicly. Official titles matter. But unofficial confidence matters too. Who receives updates? Who sits in briefings? Who is asked for input? Who speaks last? None of this is unusual on its own, but palace watchers began suggesting that certain balances may have shifted. Different interpretations emerged almost immediately. Some argued this was simply the natural evolution of influence during a reign shaped by reduced schedules and changing responsibilities. Others suggested informal authority had gradually expanded in ways that made traditionalists uncomfortable. Not because rules had been broken, but because lines had become harder to define. That distinction became increasingly important. Because inside institutions built on continuity, informal influence can become controversial faster than formal power ever does. Anonymous accounts and palace-adjacent commentary began describing an atmosphere of unusual administrative tension. Nothing explosive, nothing openly confrontational. Just subtle signs that priorities were being interpreted differently depending on who was speaking. One side reportedly emphasized modernization, flexibility, and practical adaptation. Another quietly argued that stewardship required distance, restraint, and visible procedural order. Neither position sounded unreasonable, which is why the situation became so difficult to read. Reports suggest some advisors privately worried that perception itself had become part of the problem, not because of evidence of wrongdoing, but because uncertainty creates stories of its own. Once observers begin asking who influences decisions, every meeting starts carrying meaning. Every adjustment becomes symbolic. Every silence begins sounding deliberate. And somewhere inside those competing interpretations stood Charles. Accounts describing this period repeatedly portray him in a difficult position, not choosing between people, but balancing between two equally dangerous outcomes. Act too quickly and risk appearing reactive. Act too slowly and risk appearing detached. Protect stability, but not at the cost of confidence. Maintain continuity, but not at the expense of trust. That balancing act reportedly became more complicated as speculation intensified, because the emerging narrative was no longer asking whether processes had changed. It was asking who had become powerful enough to shape them. And once authority becomes associated with proximity rather than structure, suspicion begins expanding into places facts cannot easily reach. No public disagreement emerged. No dramatic confrontation appeared. Only the growing belief that conversations were taking place somewhere beyond public view, and that whatever conclusions were being reached would not remain private forever. Then came the meeting that insiders would later describe as unusually brief and unusually final. There was no public confrontation, no raised voices, just signatures, revised oversight, and a decision that reportedly changed the balance inside the palace. That, at least, was how the story began to be told. Not as a rebellion, not as punishment, not as a dramatic fracture hidden behind palace walls, but as something colder and in some ways more consequential, a process. Quiet, administrative, controlled. According to the interpretations now circulating through royal commentary, what followed the weeks of speculation was not a sudden decision, but an internal review process that unfolded with deliberate restraint. Meetings reportedly remained small. Documentation reportedly moved through limited channels. Conversations, if they happened as described, stayed framed around continuity, governance, and institutional confidence, rather than personalities. That distinction became almost impossible to ignore, because institutions rarely admit to conflict directly. Instead, they speak through structure. Reports suggest Charles was presented with multiple paths forward. Again, accounts vary. Some describe a routine governance review, designed to reassure institutional stakeholders. Others interpret the process as a response to mounting concern over perception and internal clarity. A smaller group insists no extraordinary measures happened at all, and that normal operational updates were transformed into dramatic narratives by palace speculation. But even competing interpretations kept returning to the same idea: options. That word appeared repeatedly. If oversight had become too concentrated, redistribute responsibilities. If procedures had become unclear, formalize them. If public confidence risked becoming part of the story, create distance between authority and interpretation. Nothing emotional, everything administrative. That was reportedly the philosophy. Observers familiar with royal structures began suggesting the discussions focused less on removing influence and more on redefining where influence began and ended. Delegation, after all, exists inside every institution. Authority is shared constantly. Yet when roles become difficult to explain publicly, institutions often respond by making boundaries visible again. And according to the rumors that refuse to disappear, that may have been exactly what happened. Not titles withdrawn, not positions eliminated, but delegated authority quietly narrowed. A revision, an adjustment, a return to formal process. No dramatic language accompanied it. No acknowledgement confirmed it, which only made the speculation stronger. Because silence creates interpretation, commentators began noting something unusual. There was no effort to publicly defend anyone. No coordinated explanation. No visible campaign to deny restructuring claims. Instead, the palace reportedly maintained distance and relied on familiar language, private matters, institutional operations. No further comment. To some observers, that restraint looked ordinary. To others, it looked intentional. And that difference became the story. The more the palace refused detailed comment, the more every absence seemed meaningful. Every unchanged schedule became evidence to someone. Every delayed clarification created room for another interpretation. Yet the most striking detail was not what changed. It was how quietly it allegedly changed. No public humiliation. No dramatic removal. No visible break. Only the possibility that somewhere inside layers of protocol, responsibility had been redrawn, and everyone involved understood it without needing to say it aloud. But institutions can contain decisions. They rarely contain reactions. Because authority can be removed quietly, and consequences rarely remain quiet. The phrase wasn't financial loss. It wasn't misconduct. According to rumor cycles, the phrase that caught attention was simpler and far more dangerous: missing. That single word changed the atmosphere completely. Because numbers can be explained, procedures can be revised, administrative decisions can be reframed. But the moment the language of absence enters public conversation, something deeper begins to happen. Attention shifts away from process and moves toward suspicion. Questions become faster than answers. Interpretations begin outrunning facts. And that appeared to be exactly what happened next. Within days, competing narratives began circulating at a speed that made clarification almost impossible. Commentary accelerated. Headlines sharpened. Anonymous accounts appeared claiming knowledge of private concerns, while others dismissed the entire controversy as palace mythology feeding on ordinary institutional reviews. Yet the word remained. Missing. Not officially, not confirmed, but repeated enough that it became impossible to ignore. Some interpreted the phrase literally and assumed discussions involved vanished resources or unexplained movement. Others argued the meaning had already been distorted, that what insiders allegedly meant was missing oversight, missing documentation pathways, missing procedural clarity. But once a narrative escapes into public conversation, definitions stop belonging to the people who started it. That was the problem. Observers began pointing out something familiar about moments like these. Institutions built on symbolism become vulnerable in unusual ways. A corporation can issue a report. A government can release findings. But monarchies operate through confidence, ritual, and continuity. Silence preserves dignity until silence begins creating its own story. And according to commentators watching the reaction unfold, that threshold may have arrived. The palace refused detailed comment, no dramatic denial, no expanded explanation, no public correction beyond maintaining distance. Official restraint met public speculation, and speculation filled the empty space immediately. Analysts and commentators began discussing reputational exposure rather than legal consequences. Even those skeptical of the rumors emphasized the same concern. If uncertainty continued unchecked, perception itself could become damaging. Because institutions are not judged only by what happens, they are judged by whether people believe someone is paying attention. Then came another complication: competing leaks. One interpretation suggested internal concerns had been exaggerated entirely, and that oversight mechanisms were functioning exactly as intended. Another implied procedural changes had already happened quietly, and that rumors were arriving late to a story that had already ended. A third suggested there had never been a single issue at all, only overlapping administrative adjustments pulled into one dramatic narrative. Every explanation contradicted another. Every source seemed to know something different. And strangely, the contradictions didn't calm the story. They intensified it. Because uncertainty creates participation. Everyone becomes an interpreter. Every silence becomes evidence. Every delayed appearance becomes meaningful. The conversation stopped being about what had happened. It became about who controlled the explanation. And beneath all of it sat a quieter realization, one that experienced palace observers reportedly understood before everyone else. If the institution was allowing speculation to continue, perhaps the institution was focused on something bigger than headlines. Because while headlines chased numbers, palace veterans were watching something else entirely. Kings are remembered less for what they protect, and more for what they refuse to overlook. That idea began quietly reshaping the interpretation of everything that came before. Because once speculation reached the point where authority, stewardship, and institutional confidence became part of the conversation, the story stopped being about a single rumor and became something larger: how a monarch responds when uncertainty itself starts competing with stability. And according to the versions now circulating through palace commentary, that was the position Charles reportedly found himself in. Not confronting allegations. Not responding to headlines. Responding to risk. For centuries, monarchy has survived not because every controversy disappeared, but because the institution repeatedly signaled that continuity mattered more than discomfort. That principle appeared again and again in how observers interpreted the palace's silence. The absence of spectacle did not necessarily suggest weakness. To some, it suggested something else entirely: discipline. Reports and interpretations increasingly framed the response not as a reaction against a person, but as protection of a structure. That distinction became central. Because institutions built around legacy cannot afford to appear emotional in moments of pressure. If decisions are seen as personal, confidence fractures. If decisions appear procedural, continuity survives. And so the narrative slowly shifted. Commentators who once focused on the rumors themselves began focusing on the response. The question became less about whether allegations had merit, and more about what the palace seemed to prioritize while uncertainty spread. The answer, according to many interpretations, was continuity. Not headlines. Not rebuttals. Continuity. Reports suggest advisors increasingly emphasize stewardship, the idea that every generation temporarily manages something larger than itself. Authority, in this reading, was not meant to reward closeness, protect relationships, or preserve comfort. It existed to maintain confidence that the institution remained bigger than whoever happened to occupy its rooms. That principle reportedly influenced every decision. If procedures required clarification, clarify them. If oversight required adjustment, adjust it. If boundaries required reinforcement, reinforce them. Quietly, without performance, without creating a public winner or loser. And perhaps that was the detail that surprised observers most. There was no visible campaign of correction, no public distancing, no dramatic declaration designed to settle speculation, only restraint, because restraint itself became the message. That did not mean rumors were confirmed. It did not mean allegations were proven. In fact, uncertainty remained at the center of everything. Competing accounts continued. Interpretations stayed divided. Some insisted the entire narrative had been exaggerated beyond recognition. Others believed administrative changes had happened, but were misunderstood. Yet regardless of which version people accepted, One impression continued gaining strength, that Charles, fairly or unfairly, was being interpreted as choosing duty over comfort, institution over noise, continuity over explanation. And inside royal history, those choices are rarely painless. Because preserving legitimacy often means allowing questions to remain unanswered, if answering them creates even greater instability. But stability comes with its own cost. Once expectations shift, people begin looking for evidence that the reset was real. And that is where the next phase quietly began. Because restoring control was only the beginning. By the time observers realized something had shifted, the visible changes had already happened. That was what made the final phase feel so different from the speculation that came before. There was no defining announcement, no unmistakable turning point, no moment anyone could point to and say that was when everything changed. Instead, according to the interpretations that continued circulating around palace operations, change appeared to arrive the way institutions often prefer to move, gradually, quietly, and with enough restraint that the structure looked unchanged even as internal habits adjusted. And once people started looking closely, they believed they could see it. Not dramatic transformations, small signals, subtle recalibrations. Reports suggested oversight structures appeared tighter. Processes reportedly became more formal. Certain approvals seemed to move through clearer channels. Internal governance, at least according to observers trying to connect scattered details, began appearing less dependent on personality and more anchored to procedure. Again, none of it arrived with confirmation. But patterns create narratives, and narratives become difficult to ignore. Commentators who had spent weeks chasing theories about authority started describing something else entirely, a restoration of predictability. Not necessarily because something had broken, but because institutions often react to uncertainty by becoming more visible in how they govern. That became the emerging interpretation. Not removal. Reinforcement. Reports suggested responsibilities were being clarified rather than redistributed. Visibility increased around who handled what. Approval chains allegedly appeared more deliberate. Decision-making seemed to carry additional layers of review not as punishment, but as reassurance. And importantly, none of this appeared publicly dramatic. That restraint mattered. Because monarchies rarely reward visible correction. Public spectacle creates winners and losers. Stability requires something quieter. Adjustment without humiliation. Observers noted that appearances continued. Schedules continued. The broader public image remained remarkably controlled. If there had been internal turbulence, the institution gave little sign of it. Public engagements remained measured. Messaging stayed careful. The palace maintained its familiar approach: project continuity. Acknowledge little, avoid feeding interpretation. To supporters, this looked like discipline. To skeptics, it looked like strategy. Either way, the result was the same. Attention slowly moved away from allegations and toward atmosphere. And the atmosphere changed. The conversations became less urgent. Headlines lost certainty. Theories became softer. People stopped asking whether someone had won and started asking whether the institution had simply done what institutions always do: adapt, without announcing that adaptation happened. That possibility created its own kind of tension. Because perhaps the most effective exercise of authority is the kind that leaves no obvious trace. No confrontation. No correction ceremony. No visible reset. Only the quiet message that structures remain intact and responsibilities remain defined. And maybe that was the outcome all along. Not proving anything. Not disproving anything. Just returning attention to continuity before uncertainty became the dominant story. Because once governance becomes visible, confidence begins returning. And with confidence comes a different question entirely. Not who gained influence, not who lost it, but whether trust had been restored. And in the end, the story became less about authority and more about trust. Palaces survive scandals not by speaking first, but by outlasting the noise. And perhaps that was the quiet lesson sitting beneath everything all along. By the time speculation had slowed and the endless interpretations began colliding into each other, something unusual happened. The original questions started losing their sharp edges. People who once demanded immediate explanations began asking different questions entirely. Not what happened, not who gained influence, but what remains after the noise passes. Because institutions and individuals are remembered differently. Individuals live inside moments. Institutions survive them. That contrast has always shaped the monarchy in ways that can feel difficult to understand from the outside. Personalities rise, relationships evolve, public affection changes direction, but the institution continues moving forward with a pace that often seems detached from the urgency surrounding it. And according to many observers, that difference may explain why moments like this become so difficult to interpret in real time. Rumors thrive on immediacy. History does not. History waits. It removes certainty. It strips away emotion. It leaves behind records, outcomes, decisions, and consequences, and often discards the stories people were most convinced would matter forever. That does not mean questions disappear. It simply means not every question becomes history. Because throughout this entire episode, one reality remained impossible to escape. Uncertainty never fully left the room. The allegations remained interpreted differently, depending on who told the story. Some believed concerns had been overstated. Others remained convinced internal changes reflected something deeper. Many concluded the truth, if there was one to find, was probably less dramatic than either side wanted to admit. And maybe that ambiguity matters. Because silence inside royal institutions has never functioned as absence alone. Silence creates space, sometimes for stability, sometimes for misunderstanding, sometimes for both at once. That is why public perception becomes so powerful. When institutions refuse to narrate themselves, people begin doing it for them. Every pause gains meaning. Every adjustment becomes symbolic. Every unanswered question becomes an invitation. But there is another side to that silence. It also protects continuity. It prevents every internal correction from becoming public theater. It reminds people fairly or unfairly that monarchy has always measured time differently than headlines do. And perhaps that became the final battleground in this story. Not money. Not authority. Not influence. Legacy. The struggle over who defines what happened and who gets remembered as protecting something larger than themselves. Yet even now, no final answer arrives. No definitive explanation closes the file. No moment appears where everyone agrees on what changed, what didn't, or whether the entire story reflected concern, perception, or simply the strange gravity that surrounds royal life. Only one thing feels certain. Long after the commentary fades, long after speculation gives way to newer headlines, the institution will continue doing what institutions have always done, absorbing pressure, adapting quietly, and moving forward without waiting for permission. Because in royal history, authority can be inherited, but trust must be protected. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.